Good afternoon. For the next 30 minutes, look with me at paintings by three of the most memorable Italian Renaissance artists, Piero della Francesca, Andrea Mantegna, and Botticelli. First, Piero della Francesca, the Resurrection, a fresco painted in the late 1450s, quite large, about 7.5 feet by 6.5 feet, or 2.25 meters by 2 meters. A painter in fresco and tempera, born about 1420. Piero was also an artistic theorist and a skilled mathematician. He painted the Resurrection for the town hall of his hometown in Tuscany, Borgo San Sepolcro. Confronting, and that is the word, confronting the resurrection, many people have shared the sense that they are witnessing a picture simultaneously of this world and not of this world, an image that has always existed in our psyche and only had to be released into consciousness. If we have never encountered the Christian story or seen any of the representations of it, we still know the essence of what we are seeing, the terribly convincing emergence of a just now dead man from a tomb. It strikes us with such certainty that we accept it as a fact, as something known. Because of that, our response is not one of gasping horror at some grade B movie, but of awe. Awe is a much overused and misused word these days, whether by teenagers or generals. It is not just great fear. It is reverential fear, a mixed feeling of reverence, fear, and wonder, caused by something majestic and sublime, something that immobilizes us. That riveting effect and that complex emotion are caused first and last by the upright, resolutely frontal figure of a bearded man presented with the unwavering clarity of an archaic Greek sculpture, his face betraying neither emotion nor pain, the raised leg set very high and firmly on the edge of the tomb, projecting an indomitable power. Our awe increases when we regard the impassive eyes of this inexorably revivified man. Those hypnotic eyes seem still to have the aura of the grave. But, of course, even those who do not know who the man is, imagine a viewer from a totally different culture, will understand that it is not any man, but a sacred figure. Awe includes reverential. Of course, it is the figure of the resurrected Christ, flanked by the dead trees of winter and the rebirth of spring trees, and rising above the sleeping or stunned Roman guards with the banner of the resurrection in his hand. The soldiers also form the base of a compositional pyramid, whose apex is the head of Christ. There is a pronounced shift in tonality from the reds, browns, blue, and dark greens of the earthbound soldiers to the pale white torso and rose robe of Christ, whose head also rises above the horizon into the sky, a symbolic release from earth and death. There is always more than meets the eye, than first meets the eye when we look at a painting. And I mentioned that Piero was a noted mathematician and a theorist, and his art reflected this. The strong verticals of Christ, his banner, and the trees, combine with the solid horizontal of the tomb and the pyramid of figures into an immovable construction. And there is yet another remarkable compositional aspect. If you bisect this canvas with vertical and horizontal lines and with diagonals from corner to corner, you discover that they all, of course, converge at the same point, and that point is the navel of Christ, the umbilicus in Latin, or omphalos in Greek. Umbilicus, its geometrical meaning is as old as its anatomical one, since both obviously refer to the center. It is not hard to understand how the navel, the umbilicus, intimately connected with birth, became a crucial symbol in many cultures. In ancient Greece, the oracle at Delphi was believed to be the omphalos, the center of the world. In Rome, the umbilicus urbi was located in the Roman Forum and was the spot from which all distances in the empire were measured. And in the medieval Christian world, Jerusalem was declared the umbilicus mundi, the center of the world, and maps were drawn with Jerusalem as the center. In part because of this, the city became the ultimate Christian pilgrimage destination, the umbilicus mundi, where the death and resurrection of Christ occurred. Well, I said that this painting was made for the town hall in San Sepolcro, where it remains. If a town hall sounds like an unusual location for a resurrection, know that San Sepolcro means Holy Sepulchre, the tomb which we have seen before us. Moreover, an early chronicler of the town wrote, "Our land of Borgo San Sepolcro was called the New Jerusalem." The second artist in the lecture is Andrea Mantegna. Born around 1430 near Vicenza, Mantegna spent most of his career as court painter at Mantua, the seat of the rich and cultivated Gonzaga family. They were responsive patrons for the impressive sculptural quality and the warm palette of his notably original paintings. Deeply influenced by the remains of Roman art, he is also one of the great innovators in spatial illusionism in painting. During the 1460s, Mantegna studied the art that he could find in Florence and Pisa in preparation for a major undertaking, the decoration of a room in the palace at Mantua, later incorrectly called the Camera degli Sposi, the room of the bride and groom. This is a view of the two painted walls of the Camera degli Sposi, the fresco that we'll be talking about. Although the name stuck, the name of the Camera degli Sposi, it was simply called the painted room, Camera Picta, by contemporaries. And it was not a bedroom, but was used for banquets and entertainments, and as a place where other works of art from this famous collection were displayed. As you see, there are contrasting scenes painted on the two adjacent walls. This fresco decoration is in a distant, older, fortified tower of the palace, and it's Mantegna's principal legacy, a triumph among painted ensembles. Already a master of perspective, Mantegna refined it for this project. Probably begun in 1471 and completed in 1474, it had then no equal in the arena of illusionistic painting in an architectural setting. It remained the touchstone of trompe-l'oeil and spatial effects for generations of artists. The room is no less astonishing today, both delightful and noble, perfect in scale, with compelling portraits of the Gonzaga family, and an unforced illusionism that is at the service of its principal subject, the family of the Marchese and the Marchesa of Mantua, comfortably enjoying their palace in the company of their courtiers. I must take the time to make sure that you know what you're looking at in this brilliant creation, since distinguishing reality from illusion is especially difficult in photographs. And I want to call your attention, before looking at the right wall, to the left wall. The left wall, you see, is divided into three compartments. A door through the center one, but above that door and in the other two compartments, landscape is featured. Wonderful landscape effects with figures, hunters in the foreground on the left-hand side, members of the court, and a painting we'll look at later by itself on the right-hand side. But now we're turning our attention to the Gonzaga family and court on the right-hand wall. One wall is devoted to a group portrait of the family of Ludovico III Gonzaga and his wife, Barbara of Brandenburg, and members of the court, in which the artist cleverly uses the top of the actual large fireplace, you can see it here, the actual fireplace in that wall as the level at which he will then situate an illusionistic, moderately deep space for figures to occupy. This fictive space appears to be a loggia, an arcaded gallery, with two openings framed between arches of the real vaulted room that seems deep enough to hold figures 4 deep in front of an elaborate marble garden wall, and a tree is seen beyond or behind that wall. Nearest us sit the Marchese on the left and the Marchesa in the center, sitting with their entourage, while in the adjoining space, to the right, courtiers arriving to greet the family mount an illusionistic staircase to stand upon the real mantelpiece. Among the many clever devices is the carpet, which appears to hang down over the real wall just to the left of the fireplace of the mantel, convincingly linking the invented world to the real world. But of course, the real wall is the surface that everything is painted on, the same wall that is unpainted below. A more astonishing stroke of artistic imagination is the conjunction of real and painted architecture. The real arches of the vaulted room stop with the urn-shaped brackets which support them, and thence the vaults, while the square piers which seem to continue down from these brackets are painted illusions which are utterly convincing because figures stand in front of them. Painted figures. The heavy drapery pulled back at the far left is a painted illusion, as of course is the tapestry that hangs behind the group of men in the right-hand space. The sweep of that drapery to the left draws our eye to Ludovico, whose attention has been diverted by a messenger who probably gave him the letter in his hand. The Marchesa, with 2 of her children, also looks in the messenger's direction. Among the numerous retainers is a female dwarf. For centuries, the courts of Europe often included dwarfs, often painted with condescension. This woman, looking straight at us, possesses a memorable self-possession. Mantegna has carefully focused our attention on her and shown us her natural dignity with the same humanistic equality he bestowed on the others. And now the left-hand wall, and it's that right-hand panel on that large left-hand wall that we're looking at. It is a far more open, light-filled view into a landscape. And in the 3 connected panels, and particularly in this one, we see the meeting of Ludovico, standing on the left, and his son, Cardinal Francesco Gonzaga, on a shallow terrace opening onto the extensive landscape. Now, the cardinal had returned from Rome to visit Mantua in 1472 to mark the groundbreaking for the Grand Basilica of San Andrea, designed by Leon Battista Alberti and one of his masterpieces, and commissioned by Ludovico. This would have given Mantegna the opportunity to paint the cardinal's portrait, and I wonder if the letter delivered to Ludovico in the adjoining scene announces his son's return. The landscape, with fertile fields nearby and hills beyond, quite unlike the flat marshes of Mantua, complete with a walled city and much classical architecture and sculpture, is an obvious allusion to Rome, from whence the cardinal has come. There are enchanting details in this airy fresco, none more so than the 3 Gonzaga children who have come to meet their relative. The interplay of hands holding hands is a moment of family intimacy uncommon in Renaissance painting. I have not yet told you that only 2 walls of the square room were illuminated by windows, leaving the other 2 in shadow. That fact led Mantegna to fresco only, the 2 lighted walls plus the rib vaulted ceiling, and by making those appear open to the landscape and the sky, he created the illusion of much more light in the room. The final touch is the painted oculus in the center of the vault. The vault is mainly covered with smaller figures painted in monochrome as if they were small sculptures, but the center is entirely different. It features an illusion of an open oculus, a circular opening to the cloud-filled blue sky, which seems to light the room. That's very important, but Mantegna had wit as well as sobriety, and the opening to the sky is apparently surrounded by figures and objects, and a rather odd group they are. There is a peacock and a large wooden tub filled with plants, uncertainly balanced on a thin pole. There are the heads of women, some peering over the balustrade directly down at us. There are small putti, winged infants, poking their heads through holes in the fictive balustrade around the opening or standing precariously on a narrow cornice. These last are shown in extreme foreshortening, called di sotto in su, from below up, and are the earliest important Renaissance examples of extreme illusionism in ceiling decoration. In sum, in this painted oculus, you have the beginning of a tradition of illusionistic ceiling painting that continues for centuries. The Camera degli Sposi is the first known instance of a painted decoration that was conceived as a continuous composition over the walls and the ceiling of a room, which was designed to give the illusion that painted space on the walls and the ceiling was a continuation of the real space of the room. That, together with their great beauty of design and color and incisive portraits, constitutes their significance in the history of art. The final artist in this lecture is Sandro Botticelli. Born in 1445 in Florence, his painting is in an utterly different style than those of the last 2 artists we studied. It has long been called primavera, spring, though we do not know what the artist called it. This is primavera, painted probably between 1477 and 83 on panel, or many panels put together, about 6 foot 8 inches high by 10 foot 3 inches wide, a very large painting indeed. It's in the Uffizi Museum in Florence. The painting is known to have hung in the Florentine palace of Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco de' Medici, a younger cousin of Lorenzo the Magnificent. Beyond that, we know nothing about who commissioned it, what the artist called it, or when he painted it, or what he or the person he painted it for understood it to mean. It has most often been assigned a date about 1477 to 83, but sometimes earlier and sometimes later. Primavera is as I've mentioned, a 10-foot wide painting of 9 figures in an orange grove carpeted with flowers. The painting possesses a dreamlike lyrical beauty. Its lyricism, which is what captivates so many viewers, is, I think, comparable to music. Indeed, it may be compared to a ballet because of what we may call the choreography of the figures, the ethereal weightlessness of most of them, and the emphasis on the purely expressive lines of the bodies. I should more properly refer to balletto, the dance pageants of the Italian Renaissance, quite different from the ballet as it developed in the 19th century. The linearity is also melodious and at the same time complex in its intertwinings. The color, or tone, is delicate and pale in figures where ivory flesh tones and sheer white garments dominate, with deep rose accents in the robes of 2 figures. They are played against the dark background of a dense grove, with glimpses of a pale blue sky visible between trees. Look at the central figure of a woman standing farthest back, isolated except for a winged infant above her, delicate and restrained in motion, yet somehow suggesting that she controls the scene, the dance, if you will. Only her right hand gestures, and it seems to indicate the very dance-like group of the three women. The stage has other and equal dancers, as though several scenes were being simultaneously presented. But the painting seems to read, unusually, from right to left, and certainly the most active area is on the right. At the far right, a blue-gray figure floats into the picture and takes hold of a diaphanously draped woman who looks back at him anxiously. She seems about to collide with a woman in front of her. That woman is in some ways the most prominent figure in the painting. She is striding forthrightly, both across the stage, if I may continue the analogy, and toward us, the audience. She carries flowers in a fold of her lavishly floral-patterned dress and seems to be scattering them as she moves, as evidenced by the ground around her. She looks directly at us with a slight smile, head erect, in contrast to the more demure pose of the central woman, who also looks at us. At the far left stands one final figure. He's more rooted to one spot than the others, and his body is more firmly modeled. The emphasis is on substance and volume, rather than on outline and linearity. He brings the lateral movement in the painting to a full stop, and he does not interact with or notice any of the others since his back is turned to them. I mentioned the orange grove and the carpeted flowers on which the figures stand and move, but I should point out that the painted space is very shallow, and the grove is perceived more as a backdrop whose appearance is comparable to a tapestry, a painted tapestry of a delightful but non-specific garden grove inhabited by graceful figures. To repeat, this is a very specific kind of beauty of line and color and form and rhythm, one that is less of this world than a dream world. Now, I have not identified any of the cast, because most of us would not be able to name them all without a program. So, if the painting has not already had its effect on us, we will have lost interest. If a good poem is set to mediocre music, we pay little attention to it. In Primavera, the musical persuasiveness of the composition, its graceful figures, and the scenic backdrop are Botticelli's lasting triumph. The sheer beauty of this garden of delight is the key to the painting's appeal over so many centuries. But just as we would not want to attend a ballet without knowledge of the story that it tells or that inspired it, so the scene that we have described in Primavera is so piquant and perplexing that we want to know something of what it's about. That requires a knowledge of classical mythology, which was second nature to Botticelli and his patrons, though not to most of us. For the most part, writers do agree on this description of cast and plot. Zephyr, the gentle springtime god of the west wind, blows in from the right, pursuing the nymph Chloris. Just as he embraces her, seduces her, something remarkable occurs. Flowers emerge from her mouth. It seems that she's about to collide with Flora, the goddess of spring. But look closely at the right hand of Chloris, the lower hand, her right hand, and you will see that one of her fingers is under one of the flowers that decorates Flora's gown. Under the decoration, she's actually metamorphosing into Flora. This metamorphosis, the Roman poet Ovid wrote a long poem on the whole subject. This metamorphosis explains Flora's lack of reaction to the near collision. Ovid, in another poem, the Fasti, Book 5, described this moment as she talks. Her lips breathe spring roses. I was Chloris, who am now called Flora. This detail, more readily discovered in front of this very large painting itself than in a small reproduction, never fails to amaze one by the power of the artist's inventive imagination and representative skill, no matter how often seen. It probably elicited the same delighted surprise from his contemporaries. You are excused if you do not recognize a fully clothed Venus. That is not how she was normally represented in antiquity or in the Renaissance. Indeed, it's mainly her son Cupid above her head who makes the identification credible. Her facial type and pose are similar to some of Botticelli's many painted Madonnas. And oranges, instead of apples, often referred to the tree of knowledge in the Garden of Eden. The arch of lacy foliage behind Venus suggests a halo. Wonderful. Taken together, all of these might be intended to suggest a synthesis of Venus as a goddess of love with the Virgin Mary. In the Neoplatonic philosophical circles of that day in Florence, there was interest in reconciling or finding parallels between Christianity and classical mythology. Next to the demure Venus are the three Graces, who've been such a constant in the history of art that you may have recognized them at once. Now, Venus also stood for culture, and the Graces were interpreted by Florentine humanists as her daughters, and thus representative of aspects of culture. So we may say that the warm west wind, Zephyr, has arrived in this ideal glade, caused Chloris to become Flora, who strews the ground with flowers in the presence of this Venus Mary, who has civilized the world of erotic love into one of divine love. I have not forgotten the preoccupied man reaching upward. You may also have recognized him by the wings on his helmet or the wand he holds. He is Mercury, who, among other things, is a symbol of reason or knowledge, and thus another symbol of civilization, which might also explain why Botticelli linked Mercury and Venus by painting their robes a deep rose hue, the strongest color in the painting. What Mercury is doing is odd. He holds his magical wand, the caduceus, high, and is apparently pushing aside a cluster of tiny clouds. It has been suggested that he is dispelling confusion or ignorance, but there's no mythological precedent that I know of for this action. But we ought to recall that his caduceus was, as it still is, a symbol of medicine and doctors, and that the name Medici means doctors, and the patron saints of the Medici family were the doctors Cosmas and Damian. Had enough? Well, perhaps not, since another explanation has also satisfied many students of the painting. Stated briefly, there are striking similarities between Primavera and passages in the greatest achievement of Italian literature, Dante's Divine Comedy, the great poem which also preoccupied Botticelli in a great set of drawings. Specifically, the parallels are in the last cantos of the second canticle, Purgatory. These pages are concerned with the earthly paradise, and in them Beatrice, Dante's immortal beloved, finally reappears to him. Dante also invokes a celestial Venus and flowers and dance. He describes a place where erotic passion is transformed under the guidance of Venus into intellectual contemplation and speculation, a place where the soul finds the resolution to its spiritual pilgrimage. I quote briefly from John Ciardi's graceful translation. First, Canto 27. Dante and Virgil climb the mountain of Purgatory and sleep there. Then, at the hour, I think, when Venus, first returning out of the east, shone down upon the mountain, she who with fires of love comes ever burning, I dreamed I saw a maiden, innocent and beautiful, who walked a sunny field, gathering flowers and caroling as she went. And in Canto 28, Dante finds himself in a, quote, luxuriant, holy forest evergreen that softened the new light, an ancient, holy wood. And then, suddenly I saw come into view a lady all alone who wandered there singing and picking flowers from the profusion with which her path was painted everywhere. And then, finally, as a dancer, keeping both feet on the ground and close together, hardly putting one before the other, spins herself around, so did she turn to me upon the red and yellow flowerlets. All of the associations, interpretations, constructs that have clustered around this magnificent, mysterious painting are appropriate to the birth of love, a love purified by Christian associations, and by the love of Dante for Beatrice, also Christian in the earthly paradise. These suggestions, which are not necessarily mutually exclusive, would be appropriate for a wedding picture. With all this in mind, I think we should take very seriously the old suggestion, often reasserted, that this painting was commissioned by Lorenzo di Pierfrancesco de' Medici, in whose possession we know it was later, and that it was commissioned to commemorate his marriage in July 1482. Florentine humanists and their aristocratic friends delighted in great paintings, but expected them to convey significance, meaning. Interpretations were intellectual musings that also delighted them and instructed them. Delight and knowledge went hand in hand, a serene and satisfied couple. Thank you for your attention.